termed Yom Hashoah Day of remembering Shoah. The word Holocaust does not do justice to. V'hagvura, in the spirit of heroism, which is much deeper than many people understand. Those two elements will be expressed first, not in words, but in music, by the two songs which have become iconic in their connection to this solemn day. One, of course, is Animami, in the mournful melody of faith, and the other is the hymn of the partisans, determination to resist against incredible odds. Our Chazan, who is our voice on all of the moments most tender, will be the voice for both this year. And I encourage everyone, please, to join with him in each. One for Yom Hashoah and one for Yom Hashoah.
became a last to get them letzten Weg. Noch kimmen leine Fahrstein leine man wird noch uns neues gemeldet schon. Es wird abhocken und uns wird noch nie seinen Lohn. Man wird noch uns neues gemeldet schon. Es wird abhocken und uns wird noch nie seinen Lohn.
Dear friends, is among the most difficult occasions of our liturgical calendar for me. And in 29 years that I have approached it here in the Riverdale Jewish Center, my sense of inadequacy has not in any way abated. But how can I know? I think sometimes that where the Kedoshim of the Shoah are concerned, and even the experience of the survivors among us is concerned, perhaps the greatest and most appropriate tribute, part of an American-born rabbi, would be simply to be silent. This year, in designing the program, we made a very risky decision. And there were those who thought, perhaps still think, how dare we turn the light of attention to the children of the survivors of the Shoah, when B'li Ayin Hara, each and every one of them be preserved l'chaim tovim v'aruchim. We are still blessed to have a community within our community of those who saw, of those who experienced firsthand in different ways. And I think the presumption was that in focusing on what it meant to grow up as a child of survivors, and somehow the implication was that this was to be an evening of self-indulgent, self-pity among people who were sorry that they didn't have Yankee Doodle parents who would make life easy and simple for them. And nothing could be farther from the truth. If anything, to my thinking, this is the greatest tribute that we have ever attempted to pay our beloved survivors, because they are the generation of miracle parents. They are the generation of majestic parents, many of whom were robbed of their youth and went on to devote their lives to raising children. Many of whom were robbed of the opportunity to obtain a formal education and went on to sacrifice everything so that their children might be educated. People who worked harder than we can imagine working, with one goal in mind: that things should be good for the children. And I'm afraid that perhaps, certainly as individuals, this is not the case, but as a community, we have never allowed the voices of those children to be lifted in tribute. to be lifted in recognition of what that extraordinary generation did. How they gave what had been taken away from them. How they built what they had seen destroyed. And so tonight, we have a great scholar, someone who has carefully studied the movement from the generation of the survivors to the generation of their children. Someone who is himself the child of survivor. Some would say the child of two survivors, and who brings to this discussion an understanding, a tenderness, and a wisdom which makes him the perfect person to allow those voices to be raised. In just a few moments, I will be turning over the podium to Dr. Blumenthal and to the three generous and brave members of our community of children of survivors, and we just had the most extraordinary discussion among a large group of those before this program. We are so grateful to Elaine Martin-Diller, to Barbara DeWerth, and for Sheldon Kupferman. We will have a conversation with Dr. Blumenthal this evening. But as always, before anything else can happen, it must happen in the light of memory. It must happen in the light of the symbolic 6 candles, which, thank God, represent the light that is the presence of our own community of survivors among us. It is a light which chastens us, a light which guides us and leads us. It's a light without which the discussion doesn't begin. We are privileged to have 6 representatives of the RJC survivor community who will be accompanied by young people of our community, and as well, in some cases, accompanied by children, grandchildren, those who are here with them, to bear testimony to what I would think is the greatest heroism of all, the greatest achievement of all of the survivor community, is their achievement as parents and grandparents. If tonight is not only Yom Hashoah, but Yom HaGevurah, that's the Gevurah. The Gevurah to raise up upright generations despite all of the pain. If I could ask everyone please to rise. One by one, I will call the representatives of our survivor community to come forward and to light the 6 candles. First, I'm honored to call Rita Gottesman, who will be escorted by Ali Sherman and by a beautiful set of generations beside her to light the first candle. honor to call upon Eva Bender, who will be accompanied by Sarah Morris. We're so grateful to Eva for coming forward tonight when we all so deeply feel the age, the loss of one of the princes of our community, of Meyer Bender, one of the princely survivors. Now call upon our dear Paula Hochman, accompanied by Jonathan Fine. Now honored to have Laurie Oppenheimer, accompanied by Zebby Siegel, at the light candle number 4. Privilege to call upon our own Rita Pozalski to step forward, accompanied by Danielle Dorfeld. And for the 6th candle, please ask Margot Stern, accompanied by Joshua Dorfman. I could ask everyone, please, for just a moment of silence, to remain standing. At the conclusion of our speakers program, we will stand again in silence as we recite Kalma Rachmi and the Kaddish together for the Kadoshi. Please be seated. I'd like to please ask Dr. Blumenthal and our panelists, Elaine Martin-Diller, Robert Gewurz, and Dr. Sheldon Kupferman, to please come forward.
You guys worked out some sort of protocol? No. You guys speak first. 15 to 15. Okay, should I start now? Okay. Good evening. The rabbi of the community where I grew up used to begin his sermon with, before I speak, I want to say something. I'd like to say something too. First, I would like to begin by specifically thanking Rabbi Genek for all the work he did in arranging this. I take pride in that he's one of my students at Yeshiva, and he really is a tribute to your community as well. There's a halacha that one is mor halacha b'fnei rabba, that one is not allowed to teach Torah in the presence of his teacher, of his rabbi. I feel that way very much tonight. I'm humbled by speaking in the presence of Rabbi Rosenblatt, whom I have a very good relation for many years, but I have to tell you that for us involved in training Rabbanim, he is very much the rabbi's rabbi, and this is the address we go to when we need assistance. But I'm also humbled speaking in the presence of the survivors, and I hope and pray with the help of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that the words I will say tonight will give you your just due and the tribute that you so amply deserve. There was a comedian who once said that he's going to rewrite his autobiography to include himself. I've given many speeches, and sometimes I reference part of my background. But I'm going to do something tonight that I've never done before. And I'm going to tell you the story of Norman Blumenthal, the child of a Holocaust survivor. And I would like to concentrate and to watch and listen as I describe to you the transformation, the change that took place, and how it was experienced in my youth, and I will bring it to today, and how it's evolved and changed, and how I experience this today. And I believe it is representative as much as it can be for many children of survivors. I was born in 1952, the son of Fred Blumenthal, a native of Germany who narrowly escaped the Holocaust and even served in the American Army. He was one of the Richie boys, if you know what those are. A decorated World War II veteran who put on his tallis and filament every day for 4.5 years in American service. I have to say, Zechron Lebracha, he passed away about 1.5 years ago. And Gita Blumenthal, Tibadla Chaim, who was born in Rudnik, or as she calls it, Vidnik. We used to joke and tell her she's a redneck. The birthplace of the Kleisenberger Rebbe, who is a relative of ours, and the survivor of 7 concentration camps. My sister is told, when she was 5 years old, called my mother from a Gentile neighbor's house whom she was playing with, crying on the phone and saying, "Mommy, why didn't you tell me about Auschwitz? Why didn't you tell me about Hitler?" My experience is very different. I was born knowing. My mother had a number on her arm. When my older sister was about 4 years old, she overheard her tell a friend that my mother has a clock on her arm. We couldn't afford plastic surgery. She went to an electrolyst who burned off the number. Till today, my mother has a very, somewhat grotesque scar on her arm. I was named Naftali Tzvi, named after my very pious and learned grandfather, Rav Naftali Tzvi Cartagena, Hashem Yikom Damo, who was murdered in Auschwitz in the early 40s. I don't know exactly when. We know it was around Tisha B'Av. When I was a child, we had no pictures of my grandfather. I had no idea what he looked like. But I had hanging over my bed a picture of a very pious rabbi studying the Talmud. And I imagined that that was my grandfather. And every night when I'd go to sleep, I'd look up to him. And I'd wonder where he is, what he's doing. But more importantly, I wondered if he was proud of me, if he approved of me, if I lived up to his name. That picture, by the way, still hangs in my bedroom. When I was in 2nd grade, I attended PS 220. Those of you who don't know what's PS 220, if you're driving east on the Long Island Expressway, it's a public school right before the turnoff on the Grand Central Parkway, and that's my alma mater. It was 1960 or so. Israel was not a terribly important part of the world. It was a tiny strip of land in the Middle East. I was a normal 2nd grade boy. I played ball, I had friends, I was president of the He-Man-Hating Women's Club. I think I broke the PS 220 record for pulling pigtails during recess. Regular kid. One day our 2nd grade teacher probably had nothing else to do and asked every student to get up and announce what they wanted to be when they grew up. Those were the days of gender differences. So the girls talked about being ballerinas, nurses, actresses, models. The boys wanted to be firemen, army men, baseball players. When it was my turn, I got up and said that I want to be a diplomat so I can convince the Arabs to let the Jews pray at the Wailing Wall. And the whole class was staring at me. Nobody knew what I was talking about. Even the teacher, with no grace of chacham, was looking at me and had no idea what I was talking about. I suddenly realized what I had done and quickly said, and a baseball player. Like, oh, good, life is good, and everything was forgotten. A few years later, I was 10 years old, and I was sent for the first time for the summer to sleepaway camp. I went to Camp Kolorina, Olav Hashalom. And I came back after the summer, and the week that I came back happened to be the week that my parents were taking their one-week vacation in the Oppenheimer Hotel, Olav Hashalom, in Fleischman, New York. My father drove in, he picked me up, he fumigated the 1 or 2 items of clothing that I bothered to bring home, and he drove me up to the hotel to spend the rest of the week with my family. By the time we got up there, we had about an hour left before dinner, so my mother and father took me on a walk to hear about my summer camp experience. And it seems during that summer, they took us out to the woods, and they taught us how to chop down trees. And I was very intrigued by that. I'm not sure why. Freud may have some theory about that. But I went on and on telling my parents exactly how you chop down a tree. At one point, my mother, who never ever spoke about what she went through during the war, maybe because of the sheer boredom of what I was talking about, interrupted me and said, I know, I chopped down trees in Auschwitz. At which point I said, I'm sorry, and I stopped talking. And my parents, who were good, attentive parents, kept saying, no, no, please tell us, keep talking, please tell us. And I refused. I refused to say a word. And the three of us turned around and walked back to the hotel silently. Until today, I can hear the breaking of the twigs and the leaves as the three of us silently walked back to the hotel. So a few years later, I'm 17, and I had just gotten my driver's license. And I happened to be driving through some sleepy, very stereotypical New England town, small New England town, with the white steepled churches, the beautifully manicured homes, picket fences. And I stopped on the main street of the town. I stopped by a red light, just as the local high school was being dismissed. I don't know if my memory is playing tricks on me, but in my memory, every one of those kids crossing the street had blonde hair and blue eyes. And I saw, these were my contemporaries, I saw what I believed to be an endogenous American population. And I imagined them descendants of those from Plymouth Rock who lived for generations in this beautiful rustic town and will continue to live in this town, feeling safe and secure in America. And I was consumed by envy. I just watched them. These were my contemporaries. And I wanted so much to be like them. I wanted to be one of them. I sort of hoped and prayed that I could just put my car in park and march with them and become one of them. But I didn't want to spend my night in a prison in New England. But the jealousy and envy was palpable. Now it's a few years later. I believe I'm about a junior at YU. And I was invited to the home of my then girlfriend to meet her family for the first time. And I was busily trying to make a very good impression, which is probably one of the main reasons why she's happily married to a dentist today. And the mother served a vegetable soup. Now I have to say parenthetically, in my house, we were not allowed to eat turnips, because my mother in a concentration camp lived off of a watery turnip soup. And every once in a while, she was lucky. She got a little bite of turnips. And I knew there was this vegetable in the world called turnips, but I knew I couldn't have one. And in this vegetable soup was this white, crunchy vegetable that was very tasty. And I very innocently asked, "What is this white, crunchy vegetable in the soup?" I imagined that it was some sort of exotic Chinese vegetable that they had imported from San Francisco in my honor, of course. And they all look at me like I'm crazy and they say, "It's a turnip." I spit it out. And they're all staring at me. I couldn't swear to it, but I think I heard her mother whisper to her something about how dentists make so much more money than psychologists, but I don't know if that was actually the case. And suddenly I realized what I did. And I quickly said, "I'm allergic to turnips." And as I said, she's very happy with her dentist. Now it's a few years later, and I'm in graduate school in clinical psychology. And as many of you may know, to get your doctorate, you have to do a dissertation. You have to do an original piece of research. It's an area in which you spend many years studying. And I could say that my graduate program could be divided up into two groups. There were those who just picked an easy subject, something that had been done exhaustively already, and just changed it a little bit to get the doctorate quickly. And then there were those of us who figured if we spend years involved in the study of this subject, we might as well pick something that's close to our heart, that's meaningful. I had a classmate who suffered from anorexia when she was a teenager, who was doing her dissertation on eating disorders. I had a classmate whose parents had gotten divorced, and he did his dissertation on children of divorce. I had decided to do my dissertation on adopted children, and began the process of thoroughly researching the subject. This was before the internet, it wasn't easy, and looking to see an area in the study of adopted children where I could find something interesting or innovative. And several months into my work, I suddenly woke up one day and suddenly realized, why am I studying adopted children? I'm not adopted. At that time, no one in my family was adopted. Where does this come from? What is my interest in adopted children? And then suddenly it hit me like a ton of bricks. Being a child of Holocaust survivor is very much like being an adopted child. You have grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins. You don't even know what they look like. They come from this foreign country. They spoke a language you can't even understand. They lived a culture and a life that you can't touch, you can't connect to. And as if you were artificially transplanted here in America, where you really don't belong. And then I realized I really was trying to do a dissertation on children of Holocaust survivors. And I marched myself into the Associate Dean's office, Dr. George Stryker, and announced him that I wanted to do my dissertation on children of Holocaust survivors, when there had been no dissertation yet done on that subject. And I am eternally grateful to George, who's still alive, for his support and encouragement in that endeavor. But I have to also give you a sense of what it was like to be a child of survivor during those years in the mid-70s. Many of us had already reached the ages that our parents were either deported or to some extent liberated. And we were consumed with the Holocaust. Many of us took trips to Europe to visit the concentration camps before those trips were formalized and before they were popular. And everything centered around the Holocaust wasn't over for us. It was still going on. Soviet Jewry wasn't just an effort to save Jews. Soviet Jewry was to prevent another Holocaust. And the incipient hatred for the Jewish state on college campuses and that cesspool called the United Nations was Adolf Hitler himself coming out of the grave, ready to kill us. I remember two of my friends telling me they were having a discussion about whether Hitler wrote something in Mein Kampf. And one of them said to the other, "Why don't you call Norman? He probably reads it every night before he goes to sleep." I want to read you a poem written by a friend of mine, fellow child of Holocaust survivors. At that time, an obscure 22-year-old. Today, a very famous author. At that time, he was known as Yossi Klein. Today, he's known as Yossi Klein Halevi. I will read you the poem, I'm sure you recognize the biblical references, but I think the poem captures what it was like to be a child of Holocaust survivors in 1975. If there be 50 righteous men in Auschwitz who walk to the mountain to pray every Sabbath, hand in hand with little Isaac, body thin as side curls, raised as a Jew to be sheared, send the ram back to the forest, only grant Abraham the shochet's blade, whose soft death is merciful death, whose soft breath is merciful death. If there be 40 women of virtue in Auschwitz, daughters of Israel, violated Sabbath queens, cringing in their nakedness, let holiday skirts cover charred grayed skin, let their modesty stifle death's twisted passions. If there be 30 elderly innocents in Auschwitz, whose only sin is of a dying tree, what harm to forego the final indignity? Calm the wind, let them fall as they had grown, unheard, unnoticed, gently humming out of the earth, and bring soft beds into the ovens, and family portraits to beckon them to stillness. If there be 20 blameless invalids in Auschwitz, bent smokestacks coughing out life that once was, tell the doctors not to please mock like schoolboys, and with the reverence of science for a colony of germs, solemnly dissect the jerking bodies no one else had any use for at all. If there be 10 children in Auschwitz, a single fetus clinging to the womb, your laughter, Sarah, don't stop it. Don't stop it, Sarah. Don't stop it. Summons God's angels from the watchtowers and return the gift of little bones. You are much too old to have a son. That was being a child of Holocaust survivors in 1975. For the sake of time, and to give you the sense of how this has changed, I'm going to fast forward with 3 stories that have taken place in the last, I believe, 5 to 7 years. By now, I'm a successful professional, I'm a grandfather, I've raised a family, and the following events occurred. This was about 5 to 7 years ago. It was still sort of in the wake of 9/11, and a local Jewish community was honoring the New York City Commissioner of the Fire Department. And they asked me to come and for 2 minutes just describe some of the bereavement and trauma work that I've done in the Jewish community. And the commissioner arrived with all the top brass, and some of the top brass from the police department, and there was enormous goodwill and camaraderie there. Everybody greeting each other, members, the leaders of the Jewish community getting up, praising and thanking the members of the fire department for their heroism and bravery, and members of the fire department thanking the Jewish community for their cooperation. And finally, my turn had come to get up and do my 2 minutes on the clinical work that I do. And I had the intention, I had my presentation prepared. And as I got up to the podium, I had a sudden inspiration that I hadn't thought of until that moment. And I begged the indulgence of the audience and asked if I could just for a minute or two personally address the commissioner of the New York City Fire Department. And I turned to him and I said, Commissioner, I want you to know that I am the child of a Holocaust survivor. And my childhood abounds with stories of governments that not only didn't protect their people, but actively assaulted them and murdered them. My childhood was marred as well by memories of waking up in the middle of the night as I heard my mother shriek and scream as she revisited the 7 concentration camps in which she spent her adolescence. And my father, a decorated World War II veteran, calmly saying over and over again, Gita, the war is over. The war is over, Gita. And it is in this context that I have to tell you how meaningful it is and how thrilled I am to witness what I have witnessed tonight. To see such goodwill between the government branch and the Jewish community. And to know that we live in a time when the government not only refrains from harming us, but puts their own lives on the line to ensure our own protection and safety. And it reminds me of what wonderful and blessed times we live in, and how grateful I am to the Almighty that I've had the opportunity to live in these times. The next story, I think, took place, I'm guessing, roughly about 3 years ago. I have a son, most of you won't know him. His name is Ezra, sitting over there. And I was having a rather, given the sensibility and how rational the conversation was, I assume it was after he had made the wise decision to marry Leora. And I was having a kind of casual conversation with him. It was nothing terribly important. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned to him something that I've seen other families do that our family doesn't do. And he looked at me incredulously. And he said, well, of course, Abba, we're a Holocaust survivor family. And I felt like the ground went out from under me. I didn't say anything, but in my heart, I looked at him and I said, you too? And then I had a flashback. I had a flashback to the day when I mustered the courage to tell my mother that I was doing my dissertation on children of Holocaust survivors. I remember exactly where she was sitting and where I was standing in our old home in Forest Hills. When I told her, she burst into tears, and she told me she had a very mixed reaction. The first thing she said was, I know I'm damaged, but the thought that my children would be harmed as well is unbearable. But on the other hand, she was very satisfied and happy about it. And she told me the following story. My mother is what we would call a polyglot. She's a brilliant woman, and she's fluent in 7 languages. And when she was liberated by the British in Bergen-Belsen in 1945, they had drafted her, taking advantage of her skill, to be an interpreter. And she said, you know, because she knew Yiddish and German, she could get by in Dutch. And because she knew Spanish, she could get by in Italian. And because she knew Polish and Czech, she could get by in Russian. In fact, she said the only people she couldn't talk to were the Hungarians. You know, when God was giving out languages, he said, when he came to the Hungarians, he said, say whatever you want. And because of her exalted status in the time of liberation, some 3 weeks after liberation, one of the British officers came to her and told her that they had a film crew with them on the day of liberation. And they took a film of the concentration camp on that day. And they invited her to come for the first showing of this film. And she went into that dark tent and they started showing the film. It's 1945 in the middle of a war. The film is black and white with many breaks, very blurry. There's no sounds, there's none of the smells, none of the feel of the camp. And she said she sat there crying. And she said over and over again, no one will ever know. No one will ever know. And how satisfying it is to her to know that she has a son who wants to know. And thank God she has a grandson who wants to know as well. And the last story took place about 2 months ago. I had been asked by Project Witness to do a webinar on children of Holocaust survivors. And in this webinar, I told over that story of my drive through that rustic, sleepy New England town. And as I was preparing my presentation, and I shared this with them as I am sharing them with you, as I was preparing my presentation, I started thinking to myself, what would happen if today, some almost 45 years later, I would drive through that same town with its white steepled church and its beautiful manicured homes, and I would see those very same individuals crossing the street. Of course, they wouldn't be dismissed from high school, they probably were just dismissed from the senior citizens program. But what would happen now if I was standing there at that red light, watching these individuals crossing the street? What would be my reaction today? And I think it would be, in some respects, the same, but in some very significant ways different. I think it would be the same, because I probably also imagined them, this endogenous, secure members of the American society, descendants of those who landed in Plymouth Rock, with grandparents, and for that matter, children now and grandchildren, all living in the same home, feeling safe and secure. In that respect, it would be the same. But I think what would be different is that I wouldn't be jealous of them. In fact, I think I'd be happy for them. I think I'd be happy that their lives were so uncomplicated. I think I'd be happy that they didn't have to wake up in the middle of the night to the screams and shrieks of their mother. And I think that they were happy that they were spared the Damocles sword of the Holocaust hanging over their necks for most of their childhood. And I wouldn't be jealous because I've come to realize what a special privilege and honor it is to be a child of Holocaust survivors. I've had a very successful career, and my sensitivity to human suffering and my sense of purpose has been bred very much by knowing what a miracle it is that I'm actually on this earth. I've raised a family. I have 4 children, today adults, Torah-observant Jews, accomplished adults. I've watched the resurgence of the Jewish community. I live in a time when the day schools and yeshivas are bursting at the seams. And I've seen the state of Israel grow into a productive society that exports its technology throughout the world. And all that, wonderful gifts and accomplishment, would have so more than adequately compensated for any envy and jealousy that I would feel. And I think at this point in my life, I'm proud to be a child of Holocaust survivor. I'm proud to be the namesake of my pious and saintly grandfather. And I'm grateful to the Almighty that I've had this opportunity to be this child survivor and to live this life. And one more last point. I regularly eat turnips, and I love them. Thank you very much. I should invite you? Okay. No. Whatever. Okay. Come on, Sheldon. You're not the boss. Yeah, that's fine. So I grew up with knowledge of my mom being the youngest of 11, and 5 of her siblings and her father and her mother had passed before during the Shoah, and the siblings who remained alive were obviously very sick and pretty much died after the war within a few years, 4 years, 5 years. What was mostly fascinating to me that I found out later on in life was that my father was also the youngest and the only survivor, but that my father had had a family before the war. And my father never spoke about his son, my half-brother, never spoke about his first wife, never spoke about anything. My father did not go through the camps. My father started the war in the Polish army. When the Polish army fell, he fled into the Russian army, and he got into the Russian army, and that's how he survived the war. He never imagined that his wife and son would have been hurt. And when he came back after the war, nobody was left. So he started again, he started fresh, met my mother, married, started a family, but never spoke about his son. And growing up, it just became natural. But, you know, you grow up, your family grows, you go to school, you make new friends. Interestingly enough, most of my friends were children who were children of Holocaust survivors. We just happened to have had this natural bond, but you go on with your life.
and somehow it becomes the norm. Like the Shoah became the norm of our house. It wasn't something that we felt sorry about. It wasn't something, it just was part of our culture. It was part of who we were, and we went on. But somehow, obviously something must have been missing, because one of the greatest gifts that I received from my family was that they had decided to do the research, and a year ago found out the name of my brother. And that to me was their greatest tribute, and I thank you.
I'll sit. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the meeting that took place before.
I think you may have to like.
How's that? Is that better? So there was a meeting before this session where children of survivors were invited to come and talk. And I had a couple of very interesting flashes as a result. The first was that in the mid to late 70s, I was a member of a group of children of Holocaust survivors in Cincinnati, one of the earliest ones that had been started. And it was an absolute revelation for everyone in the room and everyone who participated, because we never had the opportunity to just exchange intimate stories about our lives the way we had that opportunity. Tonight, it was exactly the same experience. There was the same fervor, there was the same hundreds of hands. Well, there were only about 50 people, but a lot of hands going up, everybody wanting to ask questions, to say something, to share, and it was exactly the same experience in the room that I felt nearly 40 years ago in that first group of survivors. And the other interesting sense that I got was people were walking in, and I thought, I had no idea that person was a child of survivors. And then a young woman walked in, and I thought, and I know her because she was a classmate of my son's at Manhattan Day School, and I thought, well, wait, she's not a child of survivors. She's a child, she must be a grandchild. And then I remembered that her father, as a very young child, was part of the Mengele experiments. And she is, in fact, a child of survivors. So that's the session that preceded this. I'll tell you a little bit about my parents. Both survived the war, not in camps, but my mother was taken prisoner by the Russians in Kovel, which was Poland then, and now it's Belarus, and she and her elderly father and brother and sister were taken prisoner, and she left they left the rest of the family behind. Her married siblings were not taken prisoner, and her mother, the neighbors all said, why take your elderly mother? Let her stay with her children here. And so they left the mother behind, and my mother's biggest regret in life was that they left the mother behind, who of course did not survive. The town was wiped out about 6 months later. My father was born in Kovel, and he died when I was very young, so I only have the details of his story from my mother, and by the time I got interested in those details, she had begun to forget. So what I do remember was that he had deserted from an army, whether it was Polish or Russian, I'm not sure. I think it was Polish. And he was a violinist, and he hid out in the Ural Mountains and joined an orchestra. And I know he was able to do this for quite a while until the conductor of the orchestra fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. And she wasn't Jewish, and so he had to flee. And he made his way to Siberia, and because my mother was living with his cousins, he found his cousins and he met my mother, and they married in Poland and spent 4 years in a DP camp where my brother was born, and then I was born in America. So a few vignettes from my life that I think are very typical stories, or at least remind me that I'm a child of survivors. When my daughter got married in Israel, she was marrying a boy who was American, whose family had made Aliyah when he was 8 years old, and I was going to be talking at one of the Sheva Brachas, and I wanted to know a little bit more about his background, so I called my daughter, and I said, Esther, are Avi's grandparents survivors? She said, I don't know, I'll ask him. And I heard her go, Avi, are your grandparents survivors? And he said, I don't know, let me ask my parents. And I knew immediately that his grandparents were not survivors. This obsession that we all have about Germany and German products. I had broken my glasses a few years ago, but the lenses were fine, so I needed to replace the frames, and I went to a store down the street from my office, and we looked and looked and looked and finally found a pair of frames where my lenses fit perfectly. And I was getting ready to pay for them, and then, as if in neon lights, I saw "Made in Germany," and I thought, oh God, I can't take them. So I turned to the man behind the counter and I said, by any chance, do you have a file? Could you remove that "Made in Germany"? And he looked at me. But the two people in the store, the two proprietors, were an Indian and an African American. So it's as if they got it. So they took the file and they rubbed out "Made in Germany," and I bought the glasses. I was once on a train coming back from, I had spent the year at Hebrew University, and I was with friends, and I had a lot of stuff with me after completing the year, large backpack, and we were on a very crowded train heading for Italy. And as we're handing our tickets to the conductor, he said, no, this car is not going to Italy. This car is going to Germany. So we looked at each other, all children of survivors, and we thought about, he said the first car of the train was going to Italy. And we looked and we thought, so what should we do? Should we go to Germany? And all made up our minds very quickly, and we began to make our way from the last car to the next, through people with luggage and stuff on my back, and that's how much we did not want to go to Germany. So my mother lived until 101. She passed away just before Purim. And the greatest joy of her life was having 3 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. And she instilled in me a love of everything Jewish, and especially a love of Yiddish.
Many of you know me as Ellen Martin Diller. You knew my parents, Michael and Sarah Martin. Can you hear me?
Speaking for the front of the mic.
Into the mic? Is this working? Elaine Diller, and many of you know my parents, Michael and Sarah Martin, as part of this community and founders and builders in this community for the RJC and SAR and many other foundations and YU. I guess you could write another dissertation because I'm both adopted and survivor's child. So you started off with
I should have known you 40 years ago.
Should have known you 40 years ago. It comes with interesting when you said that, because I smiled and I said, oh, you really knew, maybe right behind you, sitting there. So it really has a double meaning for me, because I grew up feeling always as an outsider and feeling different. Sometimes in terms of being adopted, I don't look like everyone else. I don't feel like everyone else. Sometimes, even on an Orthodox scale, I'm asked to be a little different. So, as far as marriage and everything else. So there are little differences in my life. But as a daughter of survivors, I could not have been prouder of my parents. And the thing I think I learned the most was about adversity and how to face adversity and work it head on. And they raised me to not be a quitter and to hold my head up high. And I remember another thing, and Fafu and anyone who understands Yiddish uses this word a lot. It's what you do. And I think that the one thing that they did bring for all their many trials and tribulations, and many of you know their stories, and I'm not going to start sharing everything from soup to nuts here. What they were was they were providers to make sure and to give us a legacy of, for Judaism, for knowing who we are, for having identity, which, by the way, is very important to me as an individual. And I think that everyone has a very strong sense of Jewish identity that comes away from being a Holocaust survivor's child. It brings us together as a group. One of the things I wanted to mention is that if anyone is on Facebook, there is a group called Children of Holocaust Survivors that you can join. It's an open forum. There's also one that's called Daughters of Holocaust Survivors. That is a closed forum, where people talk about all kinds of things as far as women's issues and how they felt as survivors. I don't know if they have one for sons, but I know they have one for daughters. I'm in both groups. We talk about things, we talk about family, we talk about everything that we share that's in common. And it brings you together as a group and as a family, as an extended family. I think that when we all meet each other, we all feel as though we have extended family. And I just think that that's one of the legacies, I want to say gifts of being from, after the Holocaust, is making sure that we're all one. And it gives us a sense of unity.
We're going to now try to have perhaps a little discussion between the group. And maybe I can bring up what was a very important issue that came up in the forum that we had, which was generalizing. Just like all survivors are distinct and their experiences are distinct, how much do you generalize? How much do you say, well, we're all the same, we have the same legacy, the same experience? Or is each child a survivor unique, just as each survivor is unique? And how do you feel about those differences? Maybe some of you can comment on that, or someone wants to. Go ahead, you want to?
In terms of differences between and similarities.
Differences and similarities.
Between Holocaust survivors' kids. Wow. What are the differences and the similarities between Holocaust survivors' kids? We all share a sense of responsibility and will not disrespect our parents. Our sense of guilt is very heightened. We don't know how, and this is how I feel, and I think that this is a general thing that was expressed in the group, is we can't be disrespectful to our parents or make them feel as though they've suffered enough, so we make sure that we try to make it up for them. If, as Dr. Blumenthal mentioned about not continuing with his tree chopping story, the minute you hear that your mother says, oh, I did that in Auschwitz, everything stops right there. You can't continue because that brought back a very painful memory for your parent. And so right away you're protective and you shut down. And I think that we all say that that was one thing, that we all were very protective of our parents and making sure that they're okay. And go beyond all means to make sure that they're okay.
Another issue that came up was the difference in the children's lives, between those who had heard what their parents had gone through and those who didn't. And I always heard everything from a very young age, and so that the Holocaust became an obsession for me. So there's a big difference there for someone who didn't know. Maybe life is a little smoother.
I think in my family there was a difference between my oldest brother, who was born in a DP camp 13 years before me. By the time I was born, my parents were already settled in New York, and some of the issues that my brother had clearly I didn't have. So whenever I introduced my brother, I say that My brother is the oldest, and I'm the newer and improved version.
I think that's another issue that's very relevant for me, which I don't think we even talked about in the forum. We couldn't really cover everything. Is growing up with parents whose life experience is beyond your comprehension. That what they lived through was so foreign to anything we lived, for that matter, which was discussed in the group. What we were going through was so foreign to them. But it created in me an appreciation for what I can't understand, for what words can't describe. And therefore, I think that's, again, it's one of those kind of things. I know that has been the theme that I tried to present as a child. That was a burden. That hurt me, that I could not connect, particularly to my mother, even to some extent to my father. Today, again, for the vantage point that we're at now, is grown up and adult, mature grandparents and things like that. I think that's also been a benefit, because it's given me a sensitivity for the uniqueness of everyone's experiences. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
So one of the points that I raised, the story of the idea of the theology, or what do we take from the Shoah, and what are the values? And unfortunately, that has not been part of the discussion or the thought processes within many of the modern Orthodox, many of the Orthodox community. In fact, the first time the idea came to me was when I had a discussion with members of the Bogover community, who, as a community, was decimated by the Shoah. And I had the opportunity to ask members of that community how they dealt with it from a theological perspective. And they really didn't. I mean, their focus was really to rebuild, but there was never any values taken. And that following week, I met with some of our friends, and all of them children of Holocaust survivors, and we all agreed that there has to be some sort of theological value system, and we called it Holocaust Modern Orthodoxy, HMO. But clearly, there needs to be thought processes of what do we take, what are the values, what are we going to learn from it, and I think that really needs to be part of the scope of education and discussion.
And I think, another piece, and we'll let it conclude, and maybe that's a good way, because again, I'm looking in front of me, I'm feeling guilty. But maybe we can address ourselves collectively to the survivors, and maybe that would be a good way to conclude. And I want to say to you that besides our undying respect, that you have, through great difficulty, given us, the next generation, some really priceless gifts, a sense of understanding, a sense of empathy, and a determination to persevere and to preserve the future. And on behalf, as a representative of the next generation, I want to thank you from the depth of my heart for all that you have given us. Maybe somebody else wants to address them. Huh? I'm sorry? No, they don't want that. They don't want that. Okay. So perhaps we can conclude that, right? Okay. Thank you.
My dear friends, I'm going to ask everyone please to rise. Rabbi Genak, you can pull me from behind your camera. Rabbi Genak is really an unsung hero, has worked so hard on each of these programs, but particularly tonight, with such dedication and such love. And I would just like to, our whole team has been stellar, but I would like to mention one real hero, and that is our Chief of Building Operations, Edgar Rios, because we were so focused on the plan. Edgar said on Friday morning, has anyone made plans for the little candles of memory? And it just completely slipped our mind. And from an airport, I called Rabbi Genack in panic today. I said, oh my gosh, we forgot the yahrzeit candles. He said, no, we didn't, because Ed could remember. And it's just so touching that someone who has been part of the RJC and who comes from a different community, different ethnicity, a different faith, has understood that this is part of who we are and has made sure that this little piece was properly safeguarded. And we are so grateful to him. And when you see him, give him a yasher koach. I suspect by this time he will absolutely understand what you mean. Rabbi Genack is going to lead us in a pair of tehillim, after which we are going to say Kaddish together for the Kedoshim, and then we will, the Chazan will say the Kel Derach.
I just want to recognize my mother, who is herself a child of a survivor. My grandmother was in Auschwitz, and when I saw her number on her arm, I think I was 6, my mother told me that it's permanent, it can never come off. And I remember asking, what about with Ajax? So this program personally is so important to me and my family. Shir Hamalos, El Adonai B'Tzarasali Karasi Ve'anini, Adonai Hatzila Nafshi Misvas Sheker, Milashon Rimiyah, Ma Yitin Lacha, Ma Yosef Lach, Lashon Rimiyah, Chitzei Gibor, Shinunim, Im Gachalei V'Samim, O Yali Ki Garati Meshech, Shechati Im Halei Kedar, Rabas Shechina La Nafshi, Im Sonei Shalom, Ani Shalom V'Chi Adaber,
Please join me, everyone. Yiskadal, Yiskadash, Shemei Rabah, V'yalmad Yivarach Yerusei, V'yamlich Malchusei, V'chayechon, V'yamechon, V'chayei L'chol Beis Yisrael, V'agolo, V'zman Kuri, V'imru Amen. Yehei Shemei Rabah Mevarach, V'olam Omei Omayah, Yisparach, Yishtabach, Yispoar, Yisumam, Yisnasei, Yisadar, Yisaleh, Yisalol, Shemei, Yisha, Berichu, Le'ela, Kol B'chasa, Shirasa, Yishbachasa, V'nechamasa, Damiron, V'yolma, V'imru, Amen. Yehei Shalom Rabah, Shemai, Hayim Tovim, Oleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru, Amen. Yoseh Shalom, Yirama, V'yaseh Shalom, Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru, Amen.
ושנגמרו חיים על קידוש השם ואהוב שון שייכין עושים מתפללים ויאנוס קורס נשמו סייהם וגענה ידע תהי מלכוסו לא חי מל רחמים יעשיני בסייסה כנופו מה יצרו החיים אס נשמו סייהם אני נוי הוא נחמסון ינוחו בשלום המשכמו סייהם
There's a bridge which takes us from tonight to the next important holiday of modern Jewish history next week. And that is the song which we are about to sing, the Hatikvah. For as much as Hatikvah is associated with the modern state of Israel, Hatikvah, as that magic film clip captured it, being sung in Bergen-Belsen, is also iconic. Tonight, we will conclude with the singing of Hatikvah, the presence of our precious survivors, and pray that they be with us for many years. Next week, on Monday evening, I hope that each and every one of you, perhaps those who were not able for some conflict reason to be with us tonight, will be exactly here again to sing the Hatikvah, this time for the state of Israel and the gift that it is and continues to be each and every day. We have an extraordinary program. Ambassador Groner has seen Israel from so many vantage points, from the vantage point of a soldier, of a student, of someone who's part of the great growth of Israel as an innovative phenomenon in the world, and the celebration which will surround that evening of appreciation is something that we all want to be a part of. It would be a terrible shame to leave Hatikvah in Bergen-Belsen and not to be here next week to take it to Jerusalem.
Israel,
Friends, our deepest thanks to Dr. Blumenthal, to the panelists who made this evening so meaningful. We're now going to daven Mariv. As soon as the machitzas are put in place, we can ask everyone to please assume your davening posts. Gentlemen on this side and ladies on that. Thank you so much for being with us.